National Security Council spokesman John Kirby on Fox News Sunday offered this assessment.
There's no question that both China and Russia, and this is right out in the national security strategy, are two countries that are chafing against this international rules-based order that the United States and so many of our allies and partners have built up since the end of World War II. They'd like to rewrite the rules of the game globally.
After months of persistent aggression and violence, Russian President Putin has been charged with atrocities and war crimes by the International Criminal Court. On Fox News Sunday, Maryland Democrat Senator Chris Van Hollen told me Putin may not be heading for an international court just yet, but this is an important step.
We know that Putin and Russia have been committing war crimes in Ukraine. Here they abducted Ukrainian children and forcibly put them in Russia. So this is a signal that the rest of the international community, the ICC, recognizes that war crimes have been committed.
This is also budget season in Washington, and Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks says the Pentagon is prioritizing the world's hotspots.
Whether for tackling the pacing challenge from the People's Republic of China or confronting the acute threat of Russian aggression in Europe, deterring threats from Iran, North Korea, and global terrorist organizations, or ensuring joint force effectiveness in the face of global challenges like climate change and biological threats.
Meanwhile, many in Washington are still angry about the Russian fighter pilot destroying an American drone flying in international airspace over international waters as Moscow provokes Washington.
I think it's very telling that these pilots were given state awards once they got back to their base. So, yes, to me, this gives the stamp of approval of the Kremlin on this sort of thing.
Mississippi Senator Roger Wicker is the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee.
The answer for Americans, to me, is to make sure that the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian military has all the tools they need, the same tools we would want if our young men and women were over there fighting themselves. They're not asking us to send troops. But the very least we can do, if we really want Ukraine to win, is give them everything that we would require if we were involved in a conflict over there. And we're not doing that in a timely fashion.
Vladimir Putin was issued an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, being found guilty of war crimes. But shortly after this, he was seen making a surprise visit to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol with no real obvious reason, despite the warrant being out for him, which leads me to ask, do you think any punishment or consequences will come from this warrant, or will Putin just continue to show acts of merciless violence with no fear of repercussions?
Well, Mike, I think a lot of that depends on how this war comes out. But if, in fact, the Ukrainians are successful, if, in fact, the Russian people decide they'd like to take another course, and if there's some sort of critical mass for a change over there, that's a decision that will have to be made in Moscow. But I do not rule out the possibility that Vladimir Putin could face this. The fact certainly is that he's a war criminal and also is engaged in genocide, according to every international definition of this. He's going to be hosting another perpetrator of genocide in just a few days when President Xi of China comes into Moscow. There's no question that these are two of the most flagrant international criminals on the face of the earth, and they're our two worst adversaries, and we need to be mindful of it.
What do you think the purpose of President Xi's visit to Russia is? Is it trying to basically warn the United States that we're teaming up, we're working together, or is it Xi trying to look like he's trying to be a global peacemaker?
I don't think he's trying to look like a global peacemaker, but I do think he views himself as sort of as the one modern Chinese Communist Party leader that could return to the greatness of China's past with the emperors. So that's why he's going to the Middle East. That's why he's giving lip service to trying to get Saudi Arabia and Iran to sit down together. I don't think that will be particularly successful. But yet, I think the main thing with him is he wants China to return to their former glory, and he wants to go down in history as one of the great leaders in the entire history of the centuries and centuries of China.
Doing some research, I noticed that China is expected to increase their defense budget by more than 7%. President Biden's budget blueprint calls for about a 3% ballpark increase of the U.S. defense budget. Do you have concerns of eventually the Chinese surpassing the United States military because they're investing more in it?
Well, absolutely. And the fact is that a 3% increase is a cut in real borrowing power with 6% inflation, and really more than that. I think inflation in terms of our military purchasing is more than that. So it's a cut in what we're able to do. And you only have to look at shipbuilding. If this budget goes through, we will have fewer ships in 5 years than we have now. And China is already outproducing us when it comes to our Navy. So this is the third year in a row, Mike, that we will have to, on a bipartisan basis, increase defense spending. We did it by $45 billion last year with the omnibus, or we'd be way behind the power curve and wasting money on old priorities. So I don't know what the president is trying to do here, except that he must know that once again, Chairman Jack Reed and the chairman in the House and subcommittees over there will make sure that this budget is plussed up to a point where we can provide for the common defense of the United States of America. But for the third straight year, if Biden got his way, our defenses would be weaker for 3 straight years.
I don't need to tell you, Republicans and Democrats don't agree on much of anything these days, but is there bipartisan support for staying strong, at least in the Armed Services Committee, staying strong and making sure the military has what it needs?
Yes, there is. And it's not only Chairman Jack Reed, who, is a combat veteran himself and a graduate of West Point, and people like me, who I'm a retired United States Air Force reserve officer. But up and down the dais on both the Democratic and Republican side, yes, there's a concern that we have military needs that are not being met. And so, yes, I'm glad to say, and particularly on the Senate side. On the House side, I haven't counted the votes over there, but I do think there's a majority of both caucuses who understand that China is a pacing threat, that they are watching what's going on in Ukraine, just as they watched the disaster of the debacle in withdrawing from Afghanistan. And what we need to send is a message of resolve that the United States is equal to the task, and nobody, including China and Russia, should take a chance on us.
Chinese President Xi Jinping says his visit to Russia will be a journey of friendship, cooperation, and peace. The comments are made in a signed article published on Monday in the Russian Gazette and online.
The article, titled Forging Ahead to Open a New Chapter of China-Russia Friendship, Cooperation, and Common Development, looks back at the growth of ties over the past decade. It says China and Russia have seen frequent high-level interactions, cemented political mutual trust, and fostered a new model of major country relations. The two nations are committed to no alliance, no confrontation, and not targeting any third party in developing ties. President Xi also says they have put in place an all-round and multi-tiered cooperation framework. He adds that trade exceeded $190 billion last year, up by 116% from a decade ago. The article says China and Russia have acted on the vision of lasting friendship, strengthened traditional friendship, had close coordination on the international stage, and fulfilled their responsibilities as major countries. Looking ahead, the two countries need to enhance coordination and planning, as well as raise both the quality and quantity of investment and economic cooperation. The article also stresses the need to promote people-to-people and cultural exchanges. On the Ukraine crisis, President Xi said there is no simple solution to a complex issue, but China believes as long as all parties embrace the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and pursue rational and results-oriented dialogue, they will resolve the crisis and find a broad path toward a world of lasting peace and common security.
President Xi will pay a state visit to Russia from Monday to Wednesday. Huang Yubei reports from Moscow.
President Xi's visit is going to start today here in Moscow, and it's the ninth time for him to visit Russia as the Chinese president. And in total, the two presidents have met with each other for 40 times over the past 10 years. So you can tell the two countries have maintained close contact. And earlier, as you mentioned, the Chinese side has described the visit a trip of friendship, cooperation, and peace. And according to the news release by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, during the visit, the two presidents will have an in-depth exchange of views on bilateral relations, major international and regional issues, common concern, so as to promote strategic cooperation and pragmatic cooperation between the two countries. Although so far we still haven't got many details on the agenda, some Russian media have reported that during the visit, the two sides are expected to sign some very important bilateral documents, including a declaration on ties entering a new era, another outlining the plan to develop economic cooperation until 2030, and so on. In the meantime, some Chinese experts are also saying that the two countries are expected to further promote the connectivity of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union, and to boost the cooperation in various fields, including trade and investment, green economy, digital economy, and logistics. And under the current global situation, some analysts are also saying that the two countries have met with new opportunities, especially in areas of common development and in energy.
That was Huang Yue reporting. Amid a continued wave of global financial fears, the Union Bank of Switzerland says it'll buy rival bank Credit Suisse for over $3.2 billion and agreed to assume up to $5.4 billion in losses.
The Federal Council is therefore confident that in this difficult situation, the takeover of Credit Suisse by UBS is the best solution for restoring the confidence that has been lacking in financial markets recently, and for best managing the risk to our country and its citizens.
Sunday's announcement came as Swiss regulators were forced to step in and orchestrate a deal to prevent a crisis of confidence in Credit Suisse spilling over into the broader financial system. The Swiss banking marriage allows efforts in Europe and the U.S. to support the sector since the collapse of U.S. lenders Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. The Swiss finance minister said the bankruptcy of a globally important bank would have created irreparable consequences for financial markets. The U.S. Federal Reserve and other major central banks have announced a coordinated effort to improve banks' access to liquidity. Moving to North America, regulators are overseeing cleanup operations following the leak of 400,000 gallons of radioactive water from a nuclear power plant in Minnesota. The Xcel Energy facility says the public's not in danger from the incident, which was first reported in November last year. Jagruti Deve has details.
The company said it disclosed the incident back in November 2022, and state authorities went public with it last Thursday. In a statement, Xcel Energy said it took swift action to contain the leak to the plant's site, which poses no health and safety risk to the local community or the environment. The source of the leak is a pipe between two buildings, it emerged. Xcel has been containing the contaminated water at its own site. Now, the water contains tritium, which, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, occurs naturally in the environment in very low concentrations. It's a known byproduct of nuclear facilities, and according to the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it emits a weak form of radiation, a low-energy beta particle that's similar to an electron. It adds tritium radiation does not travel very far in air and cannot penetrate the skin. Now, Minnesota's health department says the Mississippi River has not been exposed, and Xcel says around 25% of the escaped tritium has been recovered.
That was Jagruti Deve reporting. In South America, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake has killed 15 in Ecuador and Peru. Authorities say the epicenter of Saturday's quake was in the Ecuadorian municipality of Balao, near the border with Peru. Ecuador's president says the government's made available all urgent economic resources as reconstruction work begins. Nicolas Suarez reports.
This is the strongest earthquake that has hit Ecuador since 2016.
The epicenter occurred in Balao, a small town located about 80 kilometers from the country's second largest city, Guayaquil. The earthquake left deaths, injuries, and economic losses in 11 of the 24 provinces of Ecuador. Machala was the most affected city, where authorities have counted at least 12 mortal casualties, plus 2 more in Cuenca, where a car was crashed by rubble from a collapsed patrimonial house. According to an official statement from Ecuador's government, 44 houses and 5 bridges were destroyed, while 180 other buildings, 80 schools, and more than 30 health centers were also damaged. Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso asked people to remain calm. The earthquake was also felt in the northern border with Peru, where Peruvian Prime Minister Alberto Otarola said a young child died in a building collapse. At the moment, there are no tsunami warnings for the area, and airports of Guayaquil and Cuenca remained open and operational.
That was Nicholas Suarez reporting. Finally, back in Asia, it's 20 years to the day since a U.S.-led coalition invaded Iraq based on false intelligence that the country had acquired weapons of mass destruction. The decision to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein has caused a chain of events that are still playing out in the present.
About this amount. This is just about the amount.
In February 2003, then U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell made the case for war with Iraq at the United Nations Security Council.
Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
Powell repeatedly stressed the phrase weapons of mass destruction. These alleged weapons of mass destruction were used to justify the US-led coalition's invasion of Iraq without the authorization of the UN.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
In the early morning of March 20, 2003, the US launched its shock and awe bombing campaign across Baghdad. In less than a month, the Iraqi capital fell, and with it, Saddam Hussein's government. On May 1st, Bush declared combat operations of Operation Iraqi Freedom over, and mission accomplished. In December, Saddam Hussein was captured near his hometown of Tikrit. The Iraqi High Tribunal convicted him in October 2005 of crimes against humanity. He died by hanging in December 2006. Meanwhile, the US forces intensified its search for the alleged weapons of mass destruction, but failed to find any.
We did carry out 700 inspections altogether, about 500 different places. And then we told them, yes, we've been there and we haven't found anything.
What was intended as a brief conflict led to a prolonged occupation that failed to resolve political stability and security in Iraq, and instead created more violence. During the invasion, the coalition disbanded the Iraqi army, sending armed men into the streets. The disbanded, largely Sunni army morphed into an insurgency, while Shiite leaders founded militias. The insurgents attacked US-backed forces and military personnel. In 2004, the central Iraqi city of Fallujah witnessed 2 bloody battles that left over 100 Americans dead and wounded more than 1,000 Iraqis. Despite US and coalition forces' presence, the insurgents shifted their attacks on civilians. Sectarian conflicts were also reignited. Then, nearly 9 years since the invasion, Washington announced an end to its military mission in Iraq.
Iraq's future will be in the hands of its people. America's war in Iraq will be over.
But the violence was far from over, as the radical fundamentalist group Islamic State, also known as ISIS, emerged. In the 20 years since the US invaded Iraq, more than 100,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed. 2 million of them were internally displaced. The US promised to bring peace, freedom, and democracy to Iraq. But to this day, Iraq remains mired in political instability, social unrest, and economic hardship.
An official at the Iranian president's office says Saudi Arabia's King Salman bin Abdulaziz has invited President Ebrahim Raisi to Riyadh. The invitation is said to have been extended in a letter from King Salman, but this is yet to be confirmed by the Saudis. It comes after the historic resumption of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier this month. The restoration of bilateral ties was mediated by China, ending years of hostility between the two major players in the Middle East. Both sides have announced they'll reopen embassies in each other's countries within 2 months,